if you're looking for a professional forehand to copy or emulate or steal elements from, the Raducanu forehand should be at or near the top of the list, especially in terms of its sustainability for just a normal non-professional athlete. She hits a lot of really great positions. It's so clean, great power generation. There's just a lot of things that really the average tennis player should be striving to move in the direction of. So without further ado, we'll pull up the video and start to take a look here. So uh, semi-Western forehand grip to start. Generally, we almost always would drive people towards either an Eastern, modified Eastern, or a semi-Western forehand grip. We wouldn't want to go kind of further than that in either direction, and she's got a pretty clean semi-Western there. So she starts with just a nice little unit turn. Now, one of the things to note here is we've got this left hand still on the throat of the racket here, and it stays there for a little while. And what we're doing there is it helps us keep the hips and shoulders turning together, right? If I let go of the racket with the left hand earlier in the take back, it's easy to leave the left hand behind and just kind of pivot and turn around the shoulder, and then I don't get the whole trunk moving and rotating. So we want to get that nice unit turn, which holding onto the racket until later in the swing helps do that for us. Similar to what we've seen in the backhand videos, we've got the racket head high here above the hands. So from our original take position, we're seeing the hands and the racket are coming up together as one. And we've got that nice big unit turn, and we've reached this point. We're not going to really see the hips and shoulders rotate any further back away from the tennis court than this. But if we look at all the great forehands in the game, they're going to be in some version of this position, especially this piece right here, where we've got the racket above the hands kind of approaching shoulder high. Nice big unit turn, the non-hitting arm extended around shoulder high across the body. And we'll just highlight that really quickly with this arm here like this. This is a position that we just see over and over and over again in like a Federer forehand, a Del Potro forehand, a Verdasco forehand. Like if you think about all the great forehands of the game, we're going to see some variation of this. Obviously, you get a couple of players who have fantastic forehands who don't quite hit this position, or hit a version of it maybe where there's kind of a cosmetic difference or some kind of non-functional difference that they correct for later in the stroke. Like Ruff has got like a little bit of a funky take back, but obviously he manages to correct it later in the stroke. But this is kind of one of these key positions that we want to strive for no matter who we are. Now, one of the big things that we're going to see here is that unlike the backhand, the hitting hand, in this case the right hand, this one, is not going to go really far behind the body. And so you might have seen a video out there that's come out a few years back that got really popular, which is the ATP versus WTA forehand. And there's some element of truth to that. But we were talking in the backhand video about how the increased mobility for most women's tennis players allows them and encourages them towards these bigger wind-ups, especially with the two-handed backhands, where they get this much bigger kind of extension back around behind the body. But in the forehand, that's less of a desirable piece. And what we're going to see Emma do here is bring from this top position, bring the hand in and around, but only so far to around here. And then we're going to see this transition out to the ball. So this is where we're going to see the racket drop. Where we talk about kind of the racket going from above the hand position, the racket head being above the hand, to pivoting down below the hand and coming up to contact. This move is absolutely critical in modern tennis for the modern forehand in terms of creating wrist lag and kind of maximizing our kinetic chain. It's one of these things that when players were using the heavier wooden rackets in the old days, it was a lot harder to pull off without breaking the wrist in some capacity. But we see here what's really going to happen is from this position, we're going to see this hitting hand pull out towards contact, and the racket then, I'm actually going to just try and draw this a little bit, the racket then is going to kind of flip down. And this is not something that Emma's going to do with intention, as in terms of going to manually push the racket or pull the racket down and around using her arm muscles or her wrist or her hand. She's going to let it fall into that position as a result of the hand pulling forward. And so when we talk about kind of how we use the wrist and the forehand, really a lot of the times it's not really about how we use the wrist, it's about how we let the wrist function and let the wrist move through its natural positions as a result of the forces that are coming into play on the racket through the hand. And so one of the problems is that we see a lot of players try to hit the ball with the wrist and end up with wrist injuries or forearm injuries or elbow injuries because they've got this over engagement, all these muscles in the forearm, instead of allowing the wrist to do its natural movements. And the other big thing that we see is when players don't have clean transitions, like Emma has a really clean transition. We see players who don't have a clean transition, then when we get this acceleration forward, the racket's not in a good place for the arm to be able to take up the forces and smoothly, and the racket to be able to kind of fall smoothly into the slot. And so we end up with kind of this jarring um, impact on the wrist prior to contact of when the racket kind of does this drop move. But so we're gonna just kind of see here, oh, my little arrow wasn't too bad, but see how the hand starts to pull forward from this position. It does a little bit of a drop further, but we see it starts to pull forward, and as it pulls forward, she's letting the wrist fall and rotate back as we pull forward to the ball. And that's just something that we're allowing to happen. We're not trying to kind of force this movement here. We're just pulling the hand forward through in our stroke and accelerating, and the racket's going to just drop into the slot as a natural result of the forward acceleration of the hand. The other big thing we've got to see is subtle is right here, right where the hand's about to start its forward movement. Look at this hip right here. We're going to see the hip make this little move first. See the hip starting to open. Now we're going to notice the hand's still going backwards. The hip's starting to rotate open here, right? And this is where we start the power drive with the hip. And as with all these other kind of high level ground strokes, what we're going to see here is this acceleration and then a braking of the hip. So this is the acceleration phase. And it's not this massive, massive move. We're going to pull from not quite 90 degrees to basically square to the net. That's the hip drive. That's all it is. What we often see is players over rotate the hips. So when Emma gets to this position, we see a lot of tennis players keep this hip coming around here and over rotating, and then they kind of lose the contact. And instead, what we're going to see Emma do is this classic move in these high level forehands, which is using this off center foot, not off center really, but the foot that's not being used as the axis of rotation, in this case the rear leg, is going to kick backwards in this direction, and that's going to stop the hips from rotating further. So the hips kind of hit this position where we've got our power out of them, and then the foot's going to kick back away from contact and the hips stop rotating, and that's part of what lets everything flow out to the ball, right? Because if the hips continue to rotate through the shot, then that energy's staying in the hips, and we don't really have a kinetic chain or a whip anymore, right? We've got what is essentially kind of more of a solid block where we lose a lot of efficiencies in the stroke, and we lose a lot of energy and hence racket head speed. But so we get the hips pop open, they stop, that arm whips through, the hand whips through, the racket kind of accelerates and catches up. So this is where that wrist lag comes into play. You know, we've got the racket flipped, hands accelerating forward, and then the racket releases out to the ball. And again, you can't release the racket out to the ball while holding tension in your wrist, right? That's not really how this works. And so we have to let the racket go. We have to let it accelerate. Remember, this is almost everything in tennis is really kind of a throwing motion. If we're serving, we're throwing straight upwards. In the forehand, we're throwing almost like we're skipping stones a little bit. It's kind of this slinging movement, and the racket head is the thing that we're throwing, and so we're holding onto the racket handle, obviously, not actually throwing the racket, but there's this sense almost of like I'm throwing the racket out to the ball. I just hold on enough to not let the racket go flying off. And then from there, we just let the whole thing come around. And again, like you see that this rear foot, as it goes backwards, she finishes the shot and then lets it kind of fall back around because we do still have a lot of rotational movement. This racket's moving very fast. The shoulder's going to keep coming around. And so as they come around, you're going to let the body just kind of pull forward and around. And you kind of let yourself fall a little bit into recovery after the fact. But what we're going to see is through contact, we're holding these positions. And then we're not using our body to drive around or up through contact. We're holding these positions through contact and then letting ourselves kind of fall into a recovery. So um, just one last thing to highlight that we didn't quite talk about enough is, and I'm just going to guesstimate here where this hand kind of goes to, but that the hand doesn't get all the way behind the body. Okay, almost got it, right? The hand doesn't get all the way behind the body like it might in a backhand. It's going to stay kind of in front of the hips. And so that's kind of an important piece for the modern forehand in terms of allowing space really for the racket to kind of fall into this slot here and really maximize our acceleration out to the ball and the wrist lag. So hopefully there's some helpful elements in here. If you have any questions, please feel free to leave them in the comments, and we're happy to provide some kind of clarity. And we'll see you next time.